$4,185. That is the price of the cheapest ticket for the 2026 World Cup final, almost 7 times more than it cost in Qatar. With the remaining money, we could have attended 13 group stage matches and all the knockout rounds. But what's truly concerning isn't that these are the most expensive tickets in the entire history of the World Cups, but that we also need to consider the vastness of the territory, the cost of living, and that even entry to the fan zones will be charged. So what's behind this incredible increase in ticket prices? And more importantly, how much money do we actually need to attend the most important competition on the planet? The first thing to know is that the one who determines the prices of the seats is none other than FIFA itself. It is the owner of the event, and this represents its main source of funding. Of the $7.57 billion it generated between 2019 and 2022, 83% was thanks to the Qatar World Cup. In other words, a 29-day tournament sustained 4 years of operations for the most important global football organization. Absolutely mad. However, that doesn't mean all the money comes from ticket sales. Just like other competitions, there are also 2 other major revenue streams here: television rights and sponsors. In the case of the 2022 World Cup, broadcast agreements were by far the most important aspect. These generated nearly $2.9 billion, representing almost 50% of the tournament's total revenue. And the truth is, it's really no wonder. According to FIFA's own figures, that edition drew close to 5 billion spectators worldwide. Nearly 60% of the global population was following the competition, so there's no doubt the media will do whatever it takes to broadcast it. As for sponsors, they contributed about $1.7 billion, accounting for another 28% of the revenue. Some, like Coca-Cola, Visa, and Adidas, are long-term FIFA partners. Others, such as Hisense or Budweiser, only paid to be part of Qatar 2022. The logic is exactly the same as with the television channels. With so many people watching, placing the logo there holds enormous value. Finally, we've now arrived at the part discussing ticket sales. Surprisingly, these generated a staggering $929 million, representing merely 15% of the World Cup's overall total. And while this is ahead of the remaining 11% that came through licenses and other products, its contribution still seems quite minimal. However, that graph looks considerably different as we approach the 2026 edition. FIFA's projection is that the World Cup held in Mexico, the United States, and Canada will generate a total of, listen closely, $8.9 billion, representing an increase of almost $2.6 billion compared to Qatar. The interesting thing is that this growth is not distributed equally among the different avenues we just saw, but rather one of them makes all the difference. Yes, the tickets. For this edition, television rights will continue to be the most important part at 44%, but now sponsors dropped to 20% and licenses and other income to 2%. The significant leap is definitely in ticket sales. These will represent 34% of the total, more than doubling their relevance compared to 2020, and becoming the second most important revenue stream. In absolute terms, those $929 million will transform into $3 billion, which is more than triple. Absolutely mad. Some of you might say, more games are being played, so it's only natural for ticket sales to increase because there's simply more available. That's true. Matches rose from 64 to 104, so the ticket supply is much larger. However, that argument alone is not enough to explain a 300% jump. The reason lies in 2 other fundamental factors: the initial prices and the implementation of a new sales system. Let's start with the first one. When the base rates for each match were announced, we all felt they were a little bit too high. So what we did within the ENDF team was to look back, investigate, and compare with previous World Cups to determine if prices were indeed significantly higher. For this, we didn't just consider Qatar, but went all the way back to Germany 2006, analyzing ticket costs not only for the final, but also for the group stage and the quarterfinals. When it came to initial matches, $55 were enough to get into the stadium in 2006, a fee that would even fall to just $20 in South Africa 2010. Yes, 20. Subsequently, in both Brazil and Russia, ticket prices would rise considerably, and then they would drop to a more reasonable amount for Qatar. The reasons for these changes vary. What is clear, however, is that FIFA prioritizes filling the stadiums. So, in countries that perhaps have lower purchasing power or even less tourist attraction, tickets will tend to be cheaper. Perhaps precisely for these 2 reasons. Looking ahead to the 2026 edition, if we go to their website and analyze the information, we will find that the base fare was $150, representing an increase of more than 100% compared to 4 years ago. If you're interested in the sources behind this video, check the link in the description. Returning to ticket prices, if we move to the quarterfinals, the trend shows a controlled increase across editions. The only major jump was South Africa 2010 with a 40% increase, until we add the 2026 edition and the graph completely breaks down. $725 is almost 4 times Qatar. Lastly, we have the prices for the tournament's final match. Just like in the previous table, costs rose more or less reasonably throughout the editions. But if you said, "This is my World Cup," and you want to be at MetLife Stadium on July 19th, 2026, then the base fee is $2,700 $2,790, more than 4 times what you would have paid to see Argentina-France in 2022. Absolutely mad. The big question is, will they sell? Well, FIFA is convinced they will. In fact, its president, Gianni Infantino, publicly celebrated it. The 2026 FIFA World Cup is shaping up to be the biggest and most inclusive spectacle on the planet, with more than 150 million tickets requested in the first 15 days, 30 times higher than the actual supply. They suggest part of the price increase is due to the logistical expansion of organizing the event across 3 countries. In that sense, looking at the figures, the reality is that it is true. The total budget for the tournament, meaning what FIFA will have to spend to make it happen, rose from $1.8 billion in 2022 to $3.7 billion in 2026. Having said all this, those who were paying attention probably realized that we made a mistake. While at the beginning we mentioned the cheapest ticket for the final was $4,185, just moments ago we mentioned that its actual value was $2,790. So in one of the 2 instances, we must have been mistaken. The truth is, no, or at least we are quite certain we are not. And this is due to the second pillar we mentioned regarding the increase in ticketing revenue, the new sales system. Since the 2002 Korea-Japan World Cup, FIFA has operated a system based on 3 main elements: a random draw, categorized tickets, and a fixed price allocation. The first refers to fans needing to pre-register to get their tickets. Once that period closes, a lottery is held where everyone has an equal chance to secure one. Probably some of you have done this process either for this edition or one of the previous ones. We're interested to know in the comments how many in this community have the luxury of being able to attend this competition. As for the categories, they simply differ by location and cost. They range from 1 to 4, with 1 being the most expensive and 3 and 4 the most accessible, with the condition that the last one is only for residents of the host country, in this case, the 3 of them. Those 2 elements still work the same way, and there aren't too many problems. The radical change is in the 3rd category, the price structure. Up until Qatar 2022, FIFA used a fixed rate scheme. Once prices were announced, they stayed completely invariable throughout the sales process. Looking ahead to 2026, on the other hand, they've introduced a dynamic pricing model. The difference is that now the cost of tickets adjusts based on the demand for each one, meaning it's no longer a fixed number. It's very similar to how, for example, airline fares, hotel rates, and even certain live concerts or events operate. The more people who want the same ticket, the higher the amount that the person who actually secures it will have to pay. Technically, the inverse also applies. If nobody wants it, its value will diminish. In microeconomic terms, what FIFA is doing here is appropriating the consumer surplus, that is, taking that difference that existed between what an individual was willing to pay and what they actually ended up spending. For example, the Qatar final cost around $600. It was very clear that many people were willing to pay more than that. However, the organization couldn't meet that desire or willingness of some people to spend a higher amount, so they sold everything for the same price. The best example of how the system works came when the match schedule was released. Before the matchups were known, for $400 we could attend the June 27th game at Hard Rock Stadium. Obviously, we didn't know who we would see. However, as soon as it was confirmed the match would be between Portugal and Colombia, the price soared to over $2,000. Exactly the same happened with the rest of the matches, including the final. That's why there was the gap we mentioned between the base price of $2,790 and the final cost of $4,128. Who knows how far it will go before the match? One of FIFA's main arguments for this new system is that users were already paying these high figures. The only difference is they were doing it through third-party resale sites that were often not fully safe, so the gap between the base price and the resale value wasn't going back to the organization. Now it does. Even so, resale will still exist. Imagine you're optimistic and get tickets for your team's potential semifinal, but then it's eliminated in the round of 16. Clearly, you'll want to sell them and stay home crying over the defeat. For those cases, FIFA also introduced a new feature. Now, for the first time ever, it will have its own official resale platform, the only one authorized to process original tickets. However, it will charge a 30% commission, 15% to the buyer and 15% to the seller. Another argument from Infantino and company for incorporating this dynamic pricing system is that this is how live events operate in the United States. Currently, the dynamic pricing model is not only applied to concerts, but also to the NBA, to the MLB, and even to the Super Bowl. However, we also find cases where artists decided to step back due to fan discontent. Oasis, for example, implemented dynamic pricing for their UK concerts, and it was chaos. Hundreds of thousands of people felt ripped off. That's why, for their American dates, they returned to the old, traditional fixed price. Something very similar happened with Taylor Swift, who, while she did not eliminate it entirely, established a clear limit on what the maximum price could actually be. In the case of the World Cup, at least for the time being, being, there is no set cap, and the reaction from both the media and the fans was very quick to arrive. The Football Supporters Association of England stated, "These prices are a slap in the face to the fans who support their team in the flagship tournament that is held every 4 years." They were joined by Football Supporters Europe. Football Supporters Europe is astonished by the exorbitant prices that FIFA has imposed on its most loyal fans for next year's FIFA World Cup. This represents a monumental betrayal of the World Cup tradition, ignoring the contribution of the fans to the spectacle that it is. The bidding documents, published in 2018, promised tickets for as little as $21. Where are they now? In it, they must estimate how much the tickets will cost in the different phases of the tournament, something that, as we see in the image, became quite outdated from reality. The English Federation itself showed its discontent, estimating that, to accompany its team in case of reaching the final, a person would have to spend $7,000 just on tickets. It is therefore not surprising to hear statements such as those made by Scotland's coach, Stephen Clarke. Some of these figures are truly scandalous. One of my greatest wishes is that people do not get too deeply into debt just to purchase these tickets. Even the cheapest ones still seem to be quite expensive. Seeing the global discontent that was generated, the governing body wanted to show some sensitivity and announced tickets for only $60. But the reality is that it represents a tiny portion of the available tickets. It turns out these admissions will be just 10% of each national federation's allocation. The English Federation, for example, received about $4,500 per match, but only $450 will be sold at that $60 price. Attending the great event of world football seems truly complex, and so far we're only talking about getting into the stadium. We haven't yet mentioned anything about the remaining expenses that need to be covered. In this regard, one of the biggest challenges is the vast territory to cover. Unlike Qatar 2022, where the maximum distance between stadiums was about 55 kilometers, here the venues are incredibly spread out. In fact, between Vancouver and Miami, two of the host cities, there are about 5,600 kilometers. To put it into context, between London and Moscow, there are about 3,000 kilometers, so watching 2 matches in a single day, something that used to be done in the previous edition, now seems impossible. On top of that, we risk not witnessing all the matches of our national team. If you don't believe us, just look at the situation of Algeria's fans. Their team will make its debut at Arrowhead Stadium in Kansas. For their second game, they will need to travel more than 3,000 kilometers to Levi's Stadium in Santa Clara. For their last game, they will return to Kansas, which involves another 3,000 kilometers of travel. Many will probably say, "I'm not moving from Kansas. I'm only watching the first and third game." Otherwise, they'll have to travel 6,000 kilometers just for the group stage, not to mention the final stages. If we take into account the following rounds, the most demanding scenario will be faced without any doubt by whoever earns the playoff spot among Denmark, the Czech Republic, Ireland, and North Macedonia. If this team finishes second in Group A and goes on to advance all the way to the final, then their supporters must prepare themselves for a journey of, listen closely, 16,500 kilometers. To put it into perspective, that distance is even greater than the one that exists between South America and Oceania. Absolutely mad. The silver lining is that you'll get to visit 8 cities along the route: Guadalajara, Atlanta, Mexico City, Los Angeles, Houston, Boston, Dallas, and New Jersey. The problem obviously isn't just wanting to do it, but also having the resources. While the final cost will depend a lot on the transport chosen, we can try to make an estimate. For that, let's assume we travel by bus. According to the American Public Transportation Association, the average cost is $0.16 per kilometer. If we apply that rate to a distance of 16,500, then for ground transportation alone, we're talking about $2,640, an expense that in Qatar was simply non-existent. On the other hand, we also need to consider that we require a place to sleep and eat, even if some say it's not as necessary as it seems. In that sense, the calculation is somewhat more complex because the offer is incredibly wide. Accommodation can range from campsites to those seeking comfort or even luxury, as happened in Brazil 2014, where some fans rented Ronaldinho's house for $15,000 a night. However, to get a reasonable reference, let's take the estimate from Crown Currency Exchange, one of Australia's largest currency exchange companies. According to their calculations, $230 per day should be enough for private accommodation, good food, and the occasional taxi. If we multiply that by the 39 days the tournament lasts, the expense amounts to $8,970. In 2022, however, according to Konradzina, the Polish financial services company, the daily budget was around $160. Considering that edition lasted only 29 days, the total reached $4,640, practically half of what we currently need. To conclude, we must add one last detail that breaks with tradition in World Cups. For the first time, entry will be charged for certain fan zones. In New Jersey, for example, admission will cost $1,250 per person. In conclusion, a fan who wants to follow their team throughout the 2026 World Cup will need at least $18,623, $7,000 for tickets according to the English Federation, $2,640 for internal transportation, $8,970 for accommodation and food at $230 per day, and $12.5 to access the New Jersey fan zone at least once. Of course, this doesn't include long-distance flights or entry document processing fees, since that depends depends on where each person is traveling from, which means that the 2026 World Cup is shaping up to be a real challenge from an economic perspective. Perhaps after all, it wasn't such a bad idea to go to Qatar and watch several matches every day, and even witness perhaps one of the most epic finals in history. In any case, precisely because of what FIFA's dynamic pricing is showing, this 2026 edition doesn't seem to have any problem filling absolutely all the stadiums for all the matches of the event. Now it only remains to be seen if the matches will meet expectations and if the organization can truly deliver on its promise that this will be the greatest World Cup of all time. Don't forget to subscribe, and any comments you'd like to leave, we'll be sure to read. See you next time.